The wind kicked up the dust along the dirt road, making the air feel thick and heavy. Clara Harris stood at the door of her house, one hand resting on the frame, the other clutching the hem of her faded dress. Her father's death had left her with more than just a barren farm. It had left her with a silence that stretched too long, filling every corner of the house. Her hands trembled as she wiped the dirt from the doorstep. She hadn't spoken much in days, her voice fading into the hollows of her mind. The only sound now was the wind, howling like a living thing. Then she heard the knock. It was sharp, unexpectedly, almost insistent. Her heart skipped. She didn't move at first, not sure whether she wanted to open the door. She hesitated, then stepped back inside, taking a long breath. She hadn't seen anyone in weeks. No one came by, not unless they had business. Aunt Clara's farm, sitting on the edge of nowhere, wasn't the kind of place people visited unless they had no other choice. The knock came again, louder this time, breaking the stillness. Clara reached for the handle. The cold metal bit into her skin as she pulled the door open. A man stood in front of her, a figure half hidden in the darkness of the evening. His coat was heavy, covered in mud and dust, and his face was shadowed by the brim of his hat. But his eyes, those eyes, were the first thing she noticed. They weren't the eyes of a stranger, not exactly. They were familiar, too familiar. They reminded her of something buried deep in her memory, something she had long tried to forget. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, looking at her with those eyes. Clara could feel the weight of his gaze pressing into her, pushing against the walls she had built around herself since her father's death. His presence stirred something in her. Unease, yes, but also a strange kind of curiosity. "Evenin'," he said finally, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used in a long time. Clara swallowed. "Evenin'." "Storm's comin'," he said, looking over his shoulder at the darkening sky. "I'd be much obliged if you'd let me stay the night." Clara didn't answer right away. There was something about his calm demeanor that made her uncomfortable, something about the way he spoke that didn't quite match the look in his eyes. She opened her mouth to refuse, but then she thought of the barn out back, the empty house that had been her father's, the cold that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. She looked at him again. The storm was closer now, the wind picking up. He looked like he had been traveling for days, his face rough, weathered, but there was something else, something that made her want to send him away, but also something that made her open the door wider. I don't usually take strangers in," she said, her voice faltering. "But I reckon you're not going to make it far in this weather." The man stepped forward, his boots heavy on the porch. He didn't smile, didn't thank her. Instead, he simply nodded. "I won't be a bother." Clara took a step back, her heart beating faster. "You can stay in the guest room," she said, though she didn't know why she was offering. There was no real guest room, just the old room her father used to sleep in. But she didn't think he'd mind. Not anymore. "I'll fix you something to eat," she added quickly. He nodded again. "Much obliged." He passed her without another word, stepping into the dim light of the house. Clara watched him, her eyes following his every movement. There was something about him, something unsettling, but she couldn't place it. The way he moved was deliberate, careful, like he was used to being watched, like he expected to be followed. As he walked past her, she caught a glimpse of the scar on his neck, a thick, jagged line. Clara's pulse quickened. He turned back to face her. "Name's Jack," he said, his voice flat. "Clara," she replied, almost automatically. There was silence again, and the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. Jack moved past her, heading deeper into the house. Clara stayed by the door, her hand still on the handle, unsure whether she should close it or leave it open. But there was no getting rid of him now, not without causing a scene. So, she closed it gently, her eyes lingering on the doorframe for a moment longer than she intended. Inside, Jack made himself at home, though he didn't seem to notice. He sank into the old chair by the hearth, his coat heavy with the dirt of the road. The fire crackled faintly in the corner, but Clara didn't feel its warmth. It was all so unnatural. The stillness, the suddenness of his arrival. She should have been angry, should have told him to leave, but instead, she felt something else. A strange sense of obligation, of something she owed him, though she couldn't say why. The silence between them grew thicker as Clara moved toward the kitchen. Her hands shook slightly as she set a pot on the stove, the sound of the fire crackling louder in the otherwise quiet house. The wind outside howled again, a a sharp reminder of the storm bearing down on them. She turned back to the table, where Jack sat, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes still watching her. "Are you hungry?" Clara asked, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. Jack's gaze shifted slightly, a faint glimmer of something in his eyes. "Not picky." Clara busied herself with the food, trying not to think about the unease building in her chest. She didn't know what it was about him that set her on edge, but she knew, deep down, that this man was no ordinary stranger. She didn't believe in fate, but this felt like something more. It felt like the beginning of something she couldn't control. She tried to push the thought away as she set the food down in front of him, her hands still trembling. "Here," she said, her voice sounding distant even to her. Jack nodded, but didn't reach for the food immediately. Instead, he just stared at it, his gaze distant, as if he were waiting for something. Or someone. Clara sat down across from him, feeling the weight of his silence pressing against her. And just for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition. A memory. She couldn't tell if it was real or if she was imagining it, but it unsettled her even more. Then, with a quiet sigh, Jack picked up the fork. And Clara Harris, for the first time since her father's death, felt something stir within her, something she couldn't explain, something that was bound to change everything. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, casting long shadows across the floor. Clara wiped the sleep from her eyes, the weight of the night's uneasy quiet still hanging in the air. She stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs, listening to the house settle, to the wind scratching against the window panes. She could hear the faint sound of boots on the porch, Jack, no doubt, already awake. She sighed, pulling on her worn boots, the leather cracked from years of use. The storm had passed, but the weight of it lingered. She didn't want to face the day, and didn't want to deal with the stranger in her house. But she had no choice. When she stepped outside, the farm greeted her with the familiar scent of earth and hay, but it felt different now, darker, as if the land itself had changed overnight. Jack was already at the barn, moving with a practiced ease that unsettled Clara. He worked quickly, efficiently, like he belonged there, like he had done this 1,000 times before. The thought made her stomach twist. She didn't know what bothered her more, the silence between them or the way he fit so seamlessly into her life, despite being a complete stranger. Clara turned to the garden, trying to focus on the tasks she could control. She yanked at the weeds, her hands moving mechanically as her thoughts raced. Jack's presence was too much. It was like he had always been there, lurking in the corners of her mind, and now that he was real, she couldn't escape him. As she worked, she felt his eyes on her. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him. His movements were too quiet, too deliberate. He didn't make a sound as he approached and didn't announce himself, but she knew he was there, just behind her, watching. "You need help?" His voice was low, almost too soft for the space between them. Clara glanced over her shoulder. "I'm fine." He didn't say anything more. He just nodded and moved past her, bending down to pick up a shovel. His hands were strong, his grip steady as he worked the earth with the same precision as before. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. It was as if he had done this for years, as if the land spoke to him in a language she couldn't understand. Clara swallowed, turning back to her task, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She knew it in the pit of her stomach, the way the air seemed to grow heavier around her, the way Jack's movements were too smooth, too practiced. It wasn't just the way he worked, it was the way he fit into the rhythm of the farm, as if he had always been there, waiting. Later, as the sun began to sink low in the sky, they sat down to dinner. The table between them was small, the room dimly lit by the dying light outside. The silence stretched thick and heavy, broken only by the occasional scrape of a fork against the plate. Jack didn't speak, neither did Clara. They ate, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. She couldn't stop watching him, couldn't stop the gnawing sensation that something about him was too familiar. His eyes, those damn eyes, kept pulling her in, forcing her to remember things she didn't want to remember. The scar on his neck, the way his hands moved so naturally around tools and ropes, like he'd spent a lifetime working with them. Then it hit her. It wasn't just the eyes, it was the way he moved, the way he carried himself. It was like she had seen him before, but she couldn't place where. No, not him, but something about him, something in his presence. It reminded her of something her father had said. The stories. The cryptic, half-mumbled stories her father used to tell late at night, just before the fire went out, when the room was dark enough for secrets to feel safe. She had always dismissed them, thinking they were just the ramblings of an old man, a man who had lived through too many hard years. But now, as she watched Jack sit across from her, those stories came flooding back. Her father had spoken of an outlaw, a man who had once saved his life. The outlaw had been part of something bigger, something that involved power, betrayal, and debts that could never be repaid. But Clara had never paid much attention to the details. She had thought the stories were just that, stories. The old man's way of making sense of a world that didn't make sense anymore. But Jack was too much like the man in those stories, too familiar, and now, sitting here across from him, she realized that the stranger at her door wasn't a stranger at all. He was a piece of her past that she hadn't wanted to remember, the outlaw her father had spoken of. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up her fork, and Jack's eyes flickered to her, catching the shift. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Clara's breath caught in her chest. It was as if something unspoken passed between them, something deep, buried under years of silence. She started, but her voice faltered. She couldn't bring herself to say it, couldn't name it. Jack didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his eyes unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Your father owed more than you know." Clara's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer at first. He just picked up his glass of water, staring into it as if the words were tangled somewhere deep inside him. Finally he spoke, his voice steady, but there was a hardness to it now. He made promises he couldn't keep, to men who didn't forget. Clara swallowed, her mind racing. The stories, her father's past, all the things she had pushed away for so long. It was all starting to make sense, but it made too much sense, and that terrified her. Jack set his glass down, the movement slow, deliberate. "You've got a choice to make," he said, his voice low. "We all do." Clara didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to feel. But as she sat there, staring at the man across from her, she realized that the past she had tried to outrun had found her again. And now, it was asking for something. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to give. The weight of her father's broken promises hung in the air between them. It was a promise she would have to face sooner or later. And she knew, deep down, it wouldn't be easy. The days bled into each other. The line between night and morning blurred. Jack stayed on. He didn't ask permission, didn't announce his intentions, but somehow it became clear that he wasn't leaving anytime soon. At first, Clara had thought the storm might be enough to get rid of him, that the wind would howl loud enough to drown out his presence. But as the nights passed, his quiet persistence began to fill the house like smoke, creeping into every corner. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in the air, the way the house seemed to hold its breath when he was near. At first it was subtle, a gesture here, a glance there, but soon it became undeniable. Jack's presence was no longer something she tolerated. It was something she anticipated. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than words, and every time Clara found herself looking at him, she could feel the weight of something pressing against her chest, something she couldn't name. He had become a fixture in the house, slipping in and out of her routine like an unspoken agreement. In the mornings, he worked beside her, his movements smooth, purposeful, always in sync with the rhythm of the farm. He didn't ask for much, just did what needed to be done, repairing the fence, hauling the feed, mending tools. His hands were never idle. Even when Clara found a moment to rest, he was already off, doing something else, as if he were more than just a guest in her home, as if he owned it. The power dynamics were shifting. Clara could feel it. At first, it had been her farm, her space, her rules. But now, with Jack in the picture, everything felt different. She hadn't invited him to stay, yet it was as if he had silently claimed ownership over everything. She watched him as he moved around her house, and though he never said it, there was something in the way he held himself that made her feel small. His quiet authority seemed to ripple through the air, like a current she couldn't escape. One afternoon, as she worked in the barn, Clara caught sight of Jack in the distance, standing by the fence, staring out into the horizon. He was framed by the fading light, his figure cast in long shadows, his face unreadable. She felt a sudden tightness in her chest, an instinctual wariness. She had grown accustomed to his presence, but it was unsettling in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just that he was there, in her space. It was the way he made it feel like her space was no longer hers. She could feel the unease inside her growing, pulling at the edges of her thoughts. She didn't want to admit it, but a part of her felt drawn to him. She could never understand why, though. There was no warmth in his smile, no flirtation in his tone. It wasn't attraction the way she'd known it, but something else, something darker, like gravity, pulling her in. That evening, as they sat down to eat, Clara found herself watching him again, her gaze lingering just a little too long. He was quiet, eating slowly, his face partially shadowed by the flickering candlelight. There was a heaviness to the silence between them, and though he didn't acknowledge it, she could feel it in the way he held himself, in the way his hands gripped the edge of his plate. He wasn't at ease here, but he wasn't uncomfortable either. It was as though he had settled into her life without even trying, as if he had always belonged. Jack ... Clara began, her voice faltering. She had to know. Why are you really here? He didn't look up immediately. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered, as he took another bite of his food. Finally, he met her gaze, those dark eyes locking onto hers. There was a flicker of something there, something guarded, but he didn't speak for a long time. Looking for something, he said quietly, finally breaking the silence. Something I lost. Clara's heart skipped a beat, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was speaking of the past, of her father's debts, of the promises that had been broken. But she didn't ask. She couldn't bring herself to. Instead, she turned her gaze back to her plate, her fingers clenched around the edge of the table. The unease in her stomach had twisted into something sharper, something that cut deep. She had spent so long trying to put her father's past behind her, trying to forget the shadow of it that hung over their family. But Jack had dragged it all back into the light, and now she couldn't escape it. The tension between them thickened, and Clara couldn't help but feel it. The balance of power was changing. Her house was no longer hers alone. Jack's presence was too heavy, too demanding. It had seeped into every room, every corner, until it felt as though he was part of the very walls themselves. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, startling both of them. Jack didn't react, didn't move, but his eyes followed her as she walked toward the door. I need some air, Clara said, her voice tight. She didn't wait for a response, just walked out into the cool night, feeling the weight of Jack's gaze still on her back. The wind hit her face, sharp and biting, but it wasn't enough to clear the fog in her mind. Out in the yard, Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her heart was racing, and she couldn't decide if it was the anger or the fear that had taken hold of her. Maybe both. She had known things couldn't stay the same forever, that eventually, something had to change. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the stranger to slip into her life so easily, so completely. And now, every time she looked at him, she felt that shift, the power dynamic that had moved from her to him. The question lingered in her mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. What was Jack really after? And the more she wondered, the more she realized that the answer might be something she wasn't ready to face. Clara hadn't meant to go up to the attic that day. The rain had started again, a slow, steady drizzle that made the air feel thick and oppressive, as though the sky was closing in around her. She had been trying to stay busy, to keep her mind occupied with the tasks she could control, but there was something about the quiet of the house, the way it settled around her, that made the past feel like it was breathing down her neck. The attic was always cluttered, a mess of forgotten things her father had left behind. Boxes of old clothes, half-rotten furniture, and the remnants of a life that had faded with time. She hadn't gone up there since his death. There hadn't been a reason to, and part of her had avoided it, as if the space itself might hold something she wasn't ready to find. But today, there was something calling her to it. Maybe it was the way Jack's presence seemed to pull at the edges of her thoughts, or the gnawing unease that had been growing inside her ever since he'd come into the picture. Whatever it was, Clara couldn't ignore the compulsion. She needed to see what her father had left behind, what secrets he had hidden in the corners of their home. She climbed the stairs slowly, her boots heavy on the wooden steps. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed too loud for the silence around her. Dust filled the air, and she coughed, wiping her hand across her forehead. The attic was dim, the only light coming from a small window at the far end. She squinted into the gloom, scanning the piles of old boxes and forgotten treasures. It was then that she saw it, an old wooden chest tucked away beneath a stack of blankets. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen that chest before. Or maybe she had, but hadn't thought to open it. She approached it cautiously, almost as if she were afraid to touch it. The chest was weathered, the wood dark with age, but the latch looked new, as if someone had recently opened it. She knelt down, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside were a few old letters, yellowed with time, and a small leather-bound book. The letters were tied together with a string, their edges curled and worn. Clara picked them up, the weight of them strange in her hands, and began to untie the string. As she unfolded the first letter, she saw her father's familiar handwriting, but what caught her attention were the words, "The debt must be repaid, no matter the cost." Her heart beat faster as she read further. The letter was filled with references to debts her father had incurred long before she was born, dangerous men, promises made, and then the last line stopped her cold. "The trust of a man is a dangerous thing. You'll owe more than you know when it's over." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the letter, the words echoing in her mind. This was no ordinary debt, and the men her father had dealt with weren't ordinary men. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. But one thing was clear. Jack was part of this. Somehow, he was tied to this past. His presence in the house wasn't a coincidence. She heard footsteps behind her before she could process any more. Jack. Of course! She turned, her hand still clutching the letter. Jack stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, but his eyes cold. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. He had already seen the letter in her hand. "Didn't take long for you to find it," he said, his voice low, almost measured. Clara felt the sting of his words like a slap. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. "What is all this debt?" Jack stepped into the room, his gaze flickering over the letters scattered across the floor. "Your father made promises, Clara. Promises he couldn't keep." She stood up, backing away from him, the letter still clutched in her hand. "I don't understand. What did he owe them? Who were they?" The questions came out in a rush, but Jack didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence told her everything she needed to know. She had known deep down that there was more to her father's past than he had ever told her. But now, seeing it written in black and white, it felt like a weight was settling in her chest. One she couldn't escape. Jack's eyes hardened, his jaw clenching as he looked at her. "Some debts aren't meant to be paid." The words hung in the air like a warning, and Clara couldn't help but feel the dread curl up inside her. There was something more Jack wasn't telling her, something dark that lay beneath his calm exterior. She knew it now, more than ever. Jack wasn't just a stranger. He was a part of the web her father had, woven, a man tied to a past that was quickly swallowing her whole. "I need answers," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me everything." Jack didn't respond at first. He just stared at her, his face unreadable, before finally speaking. "You won't like what you find." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. She had spent so long trying to outrun the shadows of her father's past, but they were catching up with her now, and Jack was the one bringing them back into the light. "I'm not going to let you ruin me," she said, the words sharper than she intended. But Jack just shrugged, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have a choice," he replied, his voice cold. "This was always coming for you, the moment you opened that letter." Clara's breath quickened. She turned and walked toward the window, trying to steady her thoughts, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was gathering inside her. She could feel it. The power had shifted. It wasn't her home anymore, not as long as Jack was here. The air felt thick, suffocating. Clara couldn't escape it, couldn't escape him. She knew the danger now, knew the past was closing in on her, and somehow, she knew that whatever came next, it wasn't just her father's legacy at stake, it was her life, too. Her hands shook as she looked back at the letters, at the past that was now impossible to ignore. And she knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The wind howled outside, relentless and cold. Clara sat up in bed, her body tense, the silence of the house broken by the occasional creak of the old floorboards. She tried to close her eyes, tried to ignore the unease that had taken root deep inside her chest, but sleep wouldn't come. The events of the day, of the letters and the heavy weight of Jack's silence, clung to her like a thick fog. And then there was the noise. At first she thought it was the wind, but the sound was different this time, closer, more deliberate. It was the sound of footsteps, soft at first, then louder and more rhythmic. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The house was silent, but the noise grew, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly swung her legs off the bed. Her feet hit the cold wooden floor, the chill creeping up her legs. She didn't want to go, didn't want to confront whatever was out there in the dark. But something pulled her, a strange pull deep in her gut that she couldn't explain. She crept out of her room, her footsteps barely a whisper, and made her way down the hallway, past the kitchen and out the back door. The night air hit her like a slap, cold and biting. The wind whipped her hair around her face, but it was the silence of the fields that unsettled her most. The noise had stopped, replaced by an eerie quiet. She stood there for a moment, frozen, listening to the empty space around her. Then she saw him, a figure standing at the far edge of the field, bathed in the pale light of the moon. Jack. His back was to her, his shoulders tense, his head tilted as if listening to something she couldn't hear. He stood completely still, as though waiting for something. Or someone. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Jack!" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't turn around, he didn't move, just stood there, the moonlight casting long shadows over his face, making him look like a man haunted by his past, a ghost trapped in his own memories. "Jack!" she called again, this time louder. Finally he turned, slowly, his face cold and distant, as if he hadn't heard her at all. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to stretch into something infinite, something unspoken. He said nothing, just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Clara took a step forward, her feet sinking into the soft earth. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough, like a man who hadn't used it in years. "The debts are coming due, Clara," he said, his words barely audible in the wind. "Your father's debts." Clara's stomach dropped. "I don't know what you mean," she said quickly, her mind racing. "My father didn't owe anyone anything. He was a good man." Jack's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. "A good man?" he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Your father was many things, but he wasn't a good man. He made deals, Clara, deals that didn't just cost him money." Clara shook her head, disbelief rising in her chest. "Number. That's not possible. He told me nothing of this. He never mentioned any debts, not like this." Jack stepped closer, his boots crunching the dry earth beneath him. His eyes never left hers. "He never told you because he didn't want you to know," he said, his voice now steady but filled with something Clara couldn't quite place. "He owed more than just money. He owed his life, to a man who doesn't forget, a man who collects what he's owed." Clara stepped back, her mind spinning. She couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All her life, she had believed her father's stories, the ones he told her in the quiet hours of the night, before he'd fallen asleep, drunk on whiskey. He had been a hard man, yes, but never a bad man. He had never spoken of debts like this. She had trusted him, trusted that his past was nothing more than a shadow that didn't need to be faced. But now, standing in front of her, Jack made it impossible to ignore the truth. The past Clara had so carefully buried was rising to the surface, and there was no escaping it. "Who?" Clara asked, the word barely a whisper, her throat dry. "Who did he owe?" Jack looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, as if weighing his next words. Finally he spoke. "A man named Burke, a man who doesn't let go once he has a hold of you. Your father made a deal with him, Clara, and when the time came, when the debt was due, your father couldn't pay." Clara's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. The name, Burke, was like a jagged shard of glass in her mind. She had heard whispers of the man in the shadows of town, but her father had always dismissed it. He had always promised her that there was nothing to fear, that the past was behind them. But now, standing here in the dark with Jack, the truth was undeniable. Her father's past hadn't just been a shadow. It had been a monster, lurking, waiting for its moment to strike. "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head. "You're lying. My father would never... He wouldn't." Jack stepped closer, his face hardening. "Your father made a promise to Burke," he said, his voice cold. "And promises like that are never forgotten. Not by men like him." Clara could feel the ground beneath her shift, the world around her spinning out of control. She had never wanted to know the truth. She had never wanted to face the past that haunted her father. But now, she had no choice. The past had come back to claim its due, and Jack was standing in front of her, a reminder of everything she had tried to forget. The night seemed to press in on her, the moonlight casting long shadows across the field, making the darkness feel like a living thing. Clara stood there, trembling, caught between the man she had known and the man she had feared, and in that moment, she understood. Jack wasn't just a stranger, he was a part of her father's darkest hour, a reminder that some debts could never be outrun. "Tell me what I need to do," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Tell me how to fix this." Jack's eyes softened, but just for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the shadows. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the shovel, her knuckles white, her breath shallow and uneven. The barn was silent, save for the distant sound of wind rattling the roof. But Clara's mind was anything but still. She couldn't focus. The weight of the letters, of Jack's words, of the things she had uncovered, pressed down on her like a stone. Her father's debts, Burke, the corruption. It was all so much, too much to make sense of all at once. Jack had been quiet that morning, quiet as he worked with her on the farm. He hadn't said much, hadn't made any attempt to explain what had happened the night before, and Clara had let it go. But she couldn't hold it in anymore. She couldn't stand the silence. She needed answers, needed to understand what was happening to her life, to the legacy her father had left behind. She couldn't wait any longer. She stormed into the barn, her boots slamming against the wooden floor. Jack was standing near the far wall, his back turned to her, working on fixing a fence post. He didn't look up when she entered, but Clara didn't care. Her anger flared as she stepped forward. "Why didn't you tell me?" she shouted, her voice cutting through the air. "Why didn't you tell me what you were? Who you were?" Jack paused, his hand still gripping the post, his eyes focused on the ground. He didn't speak, didn't even move, and the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Clara's heart raced as she waited, her chest tight with frustration. "You've been lying to me this whole time," she continued, her voice low but furious. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't know if something's wrong?" Jack finally turned to face her, his expression calm, almost detached. His gaze softened when it met hers, but there was a darkness behind his eyes that made Clara take a step back. He hadn't looked at her like this before, like he was seeing something she wasn't ready to face. "I didn't lie to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just didn't tell you everything." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Everything," she repeated, her voice shaking. "What do you mean?" Jack let out a long, slow breath. He didn't move toward her, didn't try to make things easier. Instead, he leaned against the fence, his arms crossed over his chest, and for a long moment, Clara thought he might not answer. But then, he spoke. "I was an outlaw," he said quietly, as though the words didn't have the weight they should. "I've done things I can't undo." Clara's mind spun. "An outlaw?" She shook her head. I was part of a larger game," Jack interrupted, his tone harder now. "Your father was too. He was caught up in something bigger than either of us. A corrupt sheriff, a crooked system. The land your family owned, it wasn't just land, it was power. And when your father tried to take it back, he made the wrong enemies." Clara felt the ground beneath her feet shift, the air around her suddenly too thick to breathe. She stepped back, her mind racing. Her father, a man who had always told her he was just trying to survive, trying to protect his family, had been involved in something much worse. It wasn't just a few bad decisions. It was a conspiracy, a betrayal. And now, that same legacy was threatening to swallow her whole. "You're saying my father, he was part of some political scheme?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper now, the shock choking her words. Jack's eyes darkened, and he nodded. He wasn't just a farmer. He wasn't just a man who worked the land. He was a part of something, a political deal with the sheriff. The land your family owned was valuable, more than just money. It was power, and when your father tried to reclaim it, he got tangled in something he couldn't untangle. Clara felt her knees weaken. She reached for the fence post, gripping it hard to steady herself. "The sheriff," she repeated, her voice thin. "But I thought the sheriff, he was supposed to protect people." Jack scoffed, the sound harsh and bitter. "The sheriff protects his own. He doesn't care about people. Not in a place like this. Not when there's money to be made." The words hit Clara like a slap to the face. The sheriff, the man she had always thought of as the authority in this town, the man her father had always respected, had been nothing more than another part of the system that had crushed her family's future. She had never seen it before, never known what lay underneath the badge, but now the truth was clear. "Your father made a promise to that sheriff," Jack continued, his voice quieter now, almost regretful. "A promise he couldn't keep, and when it came time to pay, your father tried to run. I tried to get away from it, but it was too late." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" "Burke wasn't the only one your father owed," Jack said, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "There were others, men with power who wanted more. They used your father to get what they needed, and when the time came, they called in their debts. And your father, Clara, he couldn't escape them." Clara's head swam. She couldn't process it all, couldn't understand how the man she had trusted, the father she had known, had been part of this world of corruption and lies. And now it was all coming back for her, all because of Jack. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with questions, but also with something else, something she didn't want to feel. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream at him for bringing all this back into her life. But she couldn't, not when she understood the truth. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Why did you wait?" Jack's gaze softened, but there was still a hardness to it. "Because it wasn't your fight, Clara. But now, it's yours. You're in this whether you want to be or not." The weight of his words settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Jack had been part of her father's past. He had been the man who had saved her father once, but in doing so, had bound Clara to that same past. She wasn't just fighting for her land, for her future. She was fighting for her father's sins, too. Clara stood there, her hands shaking at her sides. The barn around her felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in. She wasn't sure if she was angry or afraid or both. But one thing was certain. Jack had just revealed the truth, and now there was no escaping it. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens now?" Jack met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Now, we finish what your father started. You're in this whether you like it or not." Clara stood at the window, watching the dust swirl around the porch as the sun began to set. The house felt too quiet, too still. She hadn't heard from Jack since the confrontation in the barn, and a knot of worry tightened in her chest with each passing minute. The air outside was thick with tension, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Then she heard the horses. At first, the sound was faint, distant, but it grew louder, and Clara's heart sank. She knew who it was before they even reached the gate. The sheriff's men. She turned away from the window, her breath shallow as she made her way to the front door. Her mind raced with the possibilities, with the fear gnawing at her insides. The debts Jack had spoken of, the ones her father had left behind, were now coming to collect. And this time, there was no way out. No hiding, no running. When she stepped outside, she saw them. 2 men on horseback, their figures framed by the setting sun, their faces hidden by the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. They didn't speak at first, just sat there, watching her with eyes that seemed too cold for this place, too cold for what was supposed to be home. Clara's throat tightened, and she looked back toward the barn. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to face the truth, but there was no denying it now. Jack was involved in this, tied to these men in a way she hadn't fully understood. She had trusted him. She had let him in, even though every part of her had screamed to push him away. And now, the consequences of that trust were standing right in front of her. The men dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. One of them, a tall, thin man with a scar running down his cheek, approached her first. His eyes were hard, as if they had seen too much. His lips curled into a grim smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Clara," he said, his voice rough, like he had been chewing gravel. "We've come to collect what's owed." Clara's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, you know," the other man, broader and stockier, added with a chuckle. "Your father's debts. They don't go away just 'cause he's dead." Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was exactly what she had feared. She could feel her legs growing weak beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. She wouldn't let them see her fear. "Where's Jack?" she asked, her voice tight. "Jack?" the man with the scar repeated, a sharp laugh escaping his lips. "You'll see him soon enough." Before she could respond, she heard the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on the gravel. Jack appeared from the shadows of the barn, his face impassive, his expression unreadable. His eyes flickered to the men, then to Clara, and for a moment their gazes met, heavy with unspoken words. Clara's heart tightened, in her chest. The way he looked at her now, as if everything was out of his control, made her stomach churn. She had never seen him like this, calm, distant, almost like he was preparing for something inevitable. He approached them slowly, his hands hanging by his sides. He didn't look at Clara as he passed, and for a second she wondered if he was trying to distance himself from her, to make sure she didn't get too close to whatever it was that was happening. "You've come for your payment, then?" Jack said, his voice flat, emotionless. The man with the scar grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "You know why we're here." Jack didn't respond right away. He just stared at the men, his jaw tightening. Then, finally, he took a breath, as if steeling himself for something. "I know," he said, his voice low, "and I've got a decision to make." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jack wasn't just talking about the money, that something deeper, more dangerous was at stake here. She stepped forward, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "You don't have to do this, Jack," she said, her hands trembling at her sides. "You can walk away. You don't owe them anything anymore." Jack turned to her then, his gaze locking onto hers. For the first time, Clara saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Guilt. Regret. A darkness that ran deeper than anything she had expected. "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice strained. "You don't know what I've been through, what I've done. These men, they're not just after money, they're after everything, and they won't stop until they've taken it all." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "What are you saying?" Jack looked at her, his expression pained. But there was something else behind his eyes, something he wasn't telling her. "I've made deals I can't undo," he said quietly. "And now they want me to pay the price." Clara's heart squeezed painfully in her chest. It was the truth she had been avoiding all along, the truth that Jack was tangled in a web of lies and debts that she couldn't understand, the truth that Jack, the man she had come to care for, was bound to a past he couldn't escape. "I'll do whatever I have to," Jack continued, his voice resolute, "but I won't let them take you, not after everything." Clara's world spun as the weight of his words settled over her. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to walk away, to let go of whatever hold these men had on him. But she knew it was too late for that. She knew Jack had made his choice long before he had ever walked into her life. As the two men stood waiting, their eyes cold, Jack reached out and took Clara's hand, his grip firm but gentle. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, but she didn't pull away. Couldn't. "Come with me," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "We have to go, before it's too late." Clara hesitated for a moment, her heart torn between the man she had come to care for and the reality of the situation. Her father's legacy, his mistakes, had brought her to this point. But now, as she stood beside Jack, feeling the heat of his hand in hers, Clara realized that she had a choice. She could turn away, walk away from everything she knew, or she could follow him into the night, into the unknown, and face whatever was coming together. Without another word, Jack led her toward the darkness, their steps heavy against the earth, and Clara felt the weight of the world shift around her. The deal had been made, and there was no turning back. The first crack of flame tore through the night air like a gunshot. Clara had been standing in the yard, trying to steady her breath, trying to push down the rising tide of fear that threatened to consume her. Jack had just disappeared into the barn to gather their things, and for a moment, the only sound was the rustling of the wind through the dry grass. But then, there it was. The unmistakable crackling, the heat rising from behind the barn. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The flames were already licking up the side of the barn, hungrily devouring the wood, spreading faster than she could process. It was as if the whole world had gone up in smoke. "No!" Clara shouted, her voice raw with panic. She started running toward the fire, her feet stumbling over the dry earth, but the heat pushed her back, forcing her to stop just short of the blaze. She could feel the smoke in her lungs, burning her eyes. Her father's barn, her home, was being consumed before her eyes. Behind her, Jack's voice cut through the chaos, low and urgent. "Clara, get back inside!" Clara turned to face him. His face was set, his expression grim as he hurried toward her. His eyes were wild, but there was a calm determination behind them. He was already working, already moving with purpose. But there was something in his stance, something in the way he held himself that told her he knew exactly what was happening, and he knew what it meant. "Jack, what's happening?" Clara gasped, barely able to form the words. She could feel the weight of the fire pressing down on her chest, the heat suffocating her, and the smoke burning her throat. She couldn't think, couldn't make sense of what was happening. "It's them," Jack said, his voice low but sharp. "The sheriff's men. They've come to collect." Clara's stomach twisted. She felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her whole life was on fire. The barn, the only place that had ever felt like home, was being devoured by flames, and the sheriff's men were behind it. But it was more than just the fire. She could feel the truth closing in on her, and it felt like everything she thought she knew was crumbling to ash. Jack grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back toward the house, away from the heat. "Clara, listen to me. This is what they want," he said urgently, his grip tight on her arm. "They want everything. The land, the house, everything your father left behind." Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it, but the smoke was thick, choking her, clouding her thoughts. The fire wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just the sheriff's doing. It was part of a bigger plan, a final blow to everything her father had built, everything she had inherited, the debts Jack had told her about, the promises her father had made to the wrong men. They were all coming due. And now, Clara was caught in the middle of it, surrounded by flames and uncertainty. Jack pulled her further into the yard, urging her to run. "We need to go," he said, his voice harsh. "We don't have much time." Clara hesitated, her eyes scanning the smoke-filled horizon. Her father's legacy was burning before her eyes, and with it, her sense of who she was. The land had always been more than just land. It had been the last thing tying her to her father, the last piece of him she had left. But now, it was being ripped away from her, and she didn't know if she could fight for something that was already gone. "What do you mean we need to go?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking. She was breathing too fast, her chest tight with panic. "Where are we supposed to go?" Jack's jaw clenched, his eyes hard. "We get out. We survive. That's all that matters now." Clara's eyes widened as the weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just running from the fire. She was running from everything she had ever known, her home, her family, her past, the legacy her father had left her. It was all burning down around her, and there was nothing left to hold on to. But even as the panic surged inside her, a part of Clara, the part she had buried so deep, knew what she had to do. Survival meant leaving behind the things that had defined her. It meant walking away from the legacy of her father's mistakes, from the debts that had dragged her into this mess. "Clara, we don't have time," Jack urged, his voice breaking through the haze of her thoughts. He was already moving toward the edge of the yard, toward the trees where they could escape the smoke and the fire. But Clara stayed where she was, rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the flames that were consuming the land her family had worked for generations. "It's all gone, isn't it?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. "Everything my father worked for. It's all gone, just like that." Jack stopped, his back still turned to her. For a moment, Clara thought he wasn't going to answer, but then his voice came, softer than she expected. "Everything comes at a price," Jack said quietly, his words hanging in the air like smoke. and your father paid for his. Clara stood there, the fire at her back, the wind whipping through the grass, and she realized that Jack was right. She couldn't run away from this. She couldn't escape the past. The fire wasn't just a cleansing of the land, it was a cleansing of everything she thought she knew, everything she had believed in, and now she had to make a choice. She could turn her back on it all, walk away, leave the land, leave the pain, and never look back. But something deep inside her, something that had always been tied to this land, to her father's legacy, to everything she had fought for, told her she couldn't. Not without a fight. Clara turned toward Jack, her voice stronger now, her hands shaking with something other than fear. "We fight then," she said. "We fight for what's left." Jack's eyes softened for just a moment, a flicker of something in his gaze before he turned and took her hand. Together, they ran through the smoke, through the fire, into the night. The world around them burned, but Clara felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just the fire that was cleansing her. It was the choice to survive, to fight for a future she hadn't chosen, but would have to live. And as the smoke swallowed the world behind them, Clara made a promise to herself. She would never let the past burn her alive again. The house was cold, empty, except for the dust that clung to every surface like a layer of forgotten history. The walls, once painted with warmth and life, were now faded and cracked, the floorboards creaking underfoot, as if the house itself was groaning in its old age. Clara stepped inside, her boots leaving marks in the dust that had settled like a blanket. She could feel the weight of the silence the moment she crossed the threshold. It was thick, pressing against her chest, and it followed her into every room. Jack was behind her, moving slowly, his movements quieter than she was used to. He didn't speak, didn't say anything as he stepped past her, his eyes scanning the darkened corners of the room. There was no fire, no light to chase away the chill. Only the moonlight, faint and distant, creeped in through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the worn floor. Clara sat down in the corner, her body heavy, her thoughts too full to make sense of. She hadn't said a word since they had run from the fire, and Jack hadn't either. The weight of everything, the fire, the sheriff's men, her father's debts, hung between them like a wall they couldn't climb. Jack had been like a shadow since the night they escaped, moving through the world without really being there, and Clara found herself wondering if she was still fighting the same battle he was, or if she ever had. She rubbed her arms, trying to fight off the chill that had settled in her bones. She could feel the silence between them, a vast and empty space that neither of them had the words to fill. It wasn't just the house that was silent. It was Jack. His eyes never met hers, and for the first time, Clara realized how much of him had been hidden, how much he had kept to himself, locked away. Finally, Jack moved toward the window, staring out at the empty fields beyond. Clara didn't know what he was looking for, but she knew he wasn't seeing anything. He was lost in his own thoughts, in a place far away from the room they were sharing. "Jack," Clara said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her words were hesitant, as if speaking them might make the air even heavier. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Jack didn't look at her. His hands were resting against the windowsill, and he sighed, deep and slow, as if the weight of the world had settled in his chest. "I didn't want you to know," he said, his voice rough. "Didn't want you to see me like this." Clara's chest tightened. "Like what?" He turned to face her, his eyes dark, filled with something she couldn't quite read. "I wasn't just an outlaw, Clara. I wasn't just running from men who wanted me dead. I was running from myself." He paused, his eyes distant. "From the things I've done." Clara's heart skipped a beat, and she shifted uneasily on the floor. "You've taken lives," she said softly, more a statement than a question. She had known this, had felt it in the way he moved, the way he held himself, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way she hadn't expected. Jack nodded, his face hardening, his voice quieter. "More than I care to count. Some I didn't have a choice in. Some I did. And every one of them has followed me, haunting me." Clara couldn't find the words. She had always known Jack wasn't a man without a past. But this was more than she could have imagined. She had known grief, knew loss like an old friend. But to live with the weight of what Jack carried, how could anyone survive that? He took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. You asked me who I was, Clara. Now you know." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them felt like a wound that neither had the strength to heal. Jack had confessed, laid bare the truths he had kept hidden, and now all Clara could do was sit there, her heart heavy, trying to make sense of the man who had become a part of her life, but who had also been lost to it long before they had ever met. "I'm not proud of what I've done," Jack said, his voice breaking the silence again. "But I did what I had to survive." Clara swallowed hard, her emotions torn between empathy and disbelief. She understood survival. She had always understood survival. But this wasn't just about surviving. It was about living with the consequences of survival. "I don't know what to say to you," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She felt the sting of her own words, the weight of them settling in her, chest like a stone. She didn't know how to make sense of this man who had become so much a part of her life in so short a time. The anger she had felt toward him, the betrayal she had feared. It seemed so small now, compared to the enormity of what Jack was carrying. Jack stepped closer, and for the first time, Clara saw the vulnerability in him. It was raw, naked, and terrifying. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly, his voice strained. "You don't have to forgive me, or understand, but I needed you to know, to understand why I'm here." Clara looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of everything he had confessed, everything he had lived with. She had always thought her life was bound by the choices she had made, the things her father had left her. But Jack, his choices, his mistakes, they had brought them both to this place. She had never seen him as a man haunted by his past until now, and the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. "I don't know if I can stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can keep going like this, with everything hanging between us." Jack's expression softened, the hardness in his face melting away, but he didn't move closer. He gave her the space to decide, to find her own way out of the silence that threatened to consume them both. "I won't force you," he said, his voice low, "but if you leave, I can't promise what will happen next." Clara stood, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like the smoke that had filled her lungs. She had always thought the choices she made were hers alone to carry. But now, standing in the quiet house, with the weight of Jack's past in the air between them, she realized that survival wasn't just about escaping. It was about living with the choices that came after. And maybe, just maybe, that was the hardest part of all. The grave was freshly dug, the earth dark and damp, still unsettled from the work of the shovel. Clara stood over it, the weight of her father's death heavy in the pit of her stomach, like a stone she couldn't swallow. The air around her was thick with the scent of soil and decay, a stark reminder of what had been lost. The coldness of the morning clung to her skin, the faint drizzle of rain making the ground slippery beneath her boots. Jack stood a few paces behind her, his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't speak. He hadn't said much at all since they had arrived at the graveyard. It was as if they were both waiting for something, for some sign that they could move beyond this moment, beyond the shadow of her father's legacy. Clara's hands trembled as she clasped them together, pressing her palms against each other, willing the ache in her chest to subside. Her father's body, wrapped in a simple cloth, lay in the shallow hole, a stark contrast to the lavish funeral she had once imagined for him. But there would be no ceremony, no eulogies, only this. The reality of it settled around her, a quiet finality. Everything she had fought for, everything she had believed in, had led her here, to a grave in the cold earth, to a life she hadn't chosen. "You should say something," Jack said from behind her, his voice quieter than she expected. Clara didn't turn to face him. The words felt heavy, like the earth itself was pressing down on her. What could she say? What words could make sense of a life lived in shadows? "I don't know what to say," Clara muttered, her voice tight. She didn't know how to mourn the man who had given her life, the man who had been both protector and prisoner to a past he could never escape. She didn't know what to feel. Anger, grief, regret. It all tangled together in a knot she couldn't unravel. Jack's voice softened, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "You don't need to say anything. The promise your father made, it's done now. It's over." Clara felt a shift in the air, a tightening in her chest. She knew what Jack meant, but hearing him say it aloud made the words feel more real. The promise her father had made to Burke, to the sheriff, To everyone who had played their part in the debt that had ruined them all, it was done. Her father had never been free of it, and now neither was she. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, as if the weight of her father's life and death was too much for her to carry alone. She wasn't ready to face the truth, that her father's promises had never been hers to bear, that his debts had poisoned everything they touched. Jack stepped forward, standing beside her now. His presence was like a silent anchor, steady and unyielding. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, but he didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. "I didn't want this for you, Clara," he said quietly. "I didn't want you to be bound to this. But your father, he asked me to protect you, and I promised him I would." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the sting of the words deep in her bones. "You didn't have to keep that promise. I didn't ask you to." Jack's gaze softened, but there was a hardness behind his eyes, something she couldn't quite read. "I know," he said, his voice low, "but I made a choice, and now we're both paying for it." Clara turned her head to look at him, her eyes brimming with something she couldn't name. The truth hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Jack had been a part of her father's past, had saved him, had protected him. But at what cost? And now, Clara was standing on the edge of that same legacy, unsure of how to move forward. "Is this all I have left?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A legacy of lies and debts I didn't even know existed?" Jack didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking at her with a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. Finally, he spoke. "Number. This isn't all you have left, Clara. It's not about the legacy your father left you. It's about the choices you make now. You can rewrite your own story. You don't have to be bound to what came before." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The fire that had burned her home down, the debts that had consumed her father, none of it had been her fault. Yet, she had inherited it all. But Jack's words were a lifeline, something she hadn't expected from him. The man who had been bound to her father's past as much as she had. He was offering her a way out, a chance to move beyond the ashes and start over. She looked back down at the grave, at the empty hole that had swallowed her father's life, and something inside her shifted. The weight of her father's past was no longer hers to carry. She could walk away. She could leave the past behind. But it wasn't that simple. It never was. The ghosts of her father's mistakes still clung to her, still haunted her every step. She couldn't outrun them, not entirely, but she could decide what to do with them. Clara straightened, her back stiffening with a newfound resolve. "I won't be my father's shadow," she said, her voice steady for the first time in days. "I can't undo what's been done, but I'm not going to live in the past anymore." Jack nodded, as if he understood, as if he had been waiting for her to say it. He didn't speak, but there was something in his eyes that made Clara feel like maybe, just maybe, they could move forward together. The past would never completely release its grip on her, but she had the power to choose how she would face it. The air around them shifted again, lighter now, like the weight had been lifted. Clara stood there for a moment longer, looking down at the grave that held the man who had shaped her life. But it wasn't his legacy she would carry anymore. It was her own. With Jack at her side, she turned away from the grave, stepping forward into the future she had yet to define. It would be hard. It would be painful. But it was hers to write now. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt the first stirrings of hope. The air was thick with dust and the scent of smoke, the remnants of the fire still lingering in the dry earth. Clara stood at the edge of the field, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sheriff's men were coming. She could hear the steady thud of hooves growing louder, feel the tension in her muscles, as if her whole body was bracing for what was to come. Jack stood beside her, silent, his hand resting on the worn handle of his revolver. The world felt too quiet, too still, as if it was holding its breath. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a battle for something more. It was a reckoning with everything that had defined her life, her father's debts, Jack's past, the power of the sheriff and his men, and a chance to rewrite her own story. Clara had spent so much of her life running from the ghosts of her past, hiding in the shadows of things she couldn't control. But now, standing here beside Jack, she realized something. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. Clara turned to Jack, her voice low but steady. "This is it, isn't it?" He didn't look at her right away. His eyes were trained on the road ahead, watching the dust rise with each approaching rider. He had said little since they had made camp by the old barn, as if the silence between them was the calm before the storm. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is. We can't run anymore, Clara. Not this time." He paused, his gaze hardening. "The cost of freedom is high, but it's the only way out." Clara's heart thudded in her chest as she took in his words. She had always been told that freedom came at a price, but this was something else entirely. She could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on her, but there was no turning back. Not now. She had come too far. Her father's mistakes, his legacy, it all led here, to this moment. But she wasn't her father. She wasn't bound to his past, to his debts. She had a choice, and it was hers alone to make. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Clara knew they didn't have much time. She looked at Jack, her gaze steady, determined. He met her eyes, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it was as if time itself had stopped, as if the world had faded away, and it was just the two of them, standing side by side, ready for whatever was to come. Then Jack spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. "They're coming for everything, Clara, but I'll be damned if I let them take you too." Clara nodded, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm not afraid anymore, Jack. I don't want to run. I don't want to hide." There was a brief silence, and then Jack reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it felt like everything, like the weight of the world shifting, like they had finally found something solid to hold on to in the chaos. He gave her a tight, almost imperceptible smile, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt like she was standing on solid ground. "We fight," he said simply. "Together?" Clara turned her eyes back to the road. The sheriff's men were close now, their figures growing clearer against the setting sun. The sun itself seemed to be sinking lower, casting the land in a fiery glow. The heat of it made the air shimmer, but Clara didn't flinch. She stood tall, her back straight, the weight of her father's mistakes still heavy, but no longer defining her. She wasn't the scared, helpless woman she had been when Jack first came into her life. She wasn't just the daughter of a man who had failed. She was Clara Harris, a woman who had found her own strength, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. The first rider came into view, his horse kicking up the dirt. The sheriff's badge, gleaming on his chest. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground, her eyes locked on him. She wasn't going to be intimidated anymore. Not by the badge, not by the men who had controlled her life for so long. As the sheriff's men rode closer, Jack stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the readiness in his movements. He was prepared for this moment, had been for a long time, but Clara, she was still learning how to fight, still learning how to stand her ground. The men stopped just short of where Clara and Jack stood. The sheriff himself, a man with a face as hard as stone, rode forward. He was older than Jack, his face lined with years of hard decisions and harder lives. But there was something in his eyes, something cold and calculating that made Clara's stomach twist. "You don't have to do this, Jack," the sheriff said, his voice low but commanding. "You can walk away. It doesn't have to end like this." Clara could feel the weight of his words, the offer he was making. But it was an offer that came with a price, an offer that would mean surrendering everything she had just started to reclaim. Jack's eyes didn't leave the sheriff's face. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Jack's voice was flat, the anger in it like a steady pulse beneath the surface. "You think you can scare me into walking away from this? I've already made my choice." The sheriff's eyes flickered, a hint of surprise crossing his face. But it was quickly replaced with something darker, something more dangerous. "Then you've sealed your fate," he said, his voice like steel. Before the sheriff could give the order, the world exploded in a flurry of movement. Gunshots rang out, echoing through the empty fields, the air thick with smoke and the sound of hooves pounding the earth. Clara's heart raced, her hands trembling as she moved beside Jack, taking cover behind a nearby tree. The fight was brutal, fast. Clara had never imagined that her life would come to this, that she would stand in the middle of a battle that had nothing to do with her, yet everything to do with what she was willing to fight for. The sheriff's men were relentless, but Jack was quicker, deadlier. They were outnumbered, but Clara didn't feel fear. She felt something else, something stronger, something fiercer. As the last of the sheriff's men fell, Clara stood with her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body covered in dust and dirt, but her heart was lighter. The battle had been won, but the cost of freedom had been high. Her father's legacy was burned away, scattered into the wind, and with it, the chains that had bound her. Jack stood beside her, his face grim, but his eyes filled with something else, something Clara couldn't name, a sense of finality, of peace. They had fought, and they had won. "You did it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We did." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fight had been fought, and the future was theirs to carve, together. The dust settled slowly, swirling in the stillness of the morning light. Clara stood at the edge of the land, her eyes tracing the horizon where the sky met the earth. Everything around her felt different now, like a weight had been lifted, a burden she had carried for too long, finally let go. The past was still there, its shadows lingering, but it no longer controlled her. It no longer had a hold on her future. Jack stood beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. He hadn't spoken much since the fight, but she didn't need words. They had both said everything that needed to be said. The air between them was no longer filled with uncertainty, no longer weighed down by the ghosts of their pasts. It was just the two of them now, standing together at the precipice of something new. For the first time, Clara could breathe. She looked at Jack, her eyes searching his face, seeing him for who he was now, the man who had once been a stranger, who had once carried the same shadows she had, but who had become something more. She had trusted him when she thought she couldn't, had chosen to believe in him when the world told her not to. And now, he wasn't the outlaw she had once feared. He was the one who had stood by her, fought for her, and helped her reclaim her life. "Do you think we'll ever find peace?" Clara asked, her voice soft but steady. Jack glanced at her, a faint, rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think we already have," he said, his voice quieter than it had been in the past. "We've fought for it, now we live for it." Clara nodded, her heart lighter than it had ever been. The land she had once thought of as her prison, the land that had tied her to her father's mistakes, was now a symbol of her freedom. It was no longer the place that had held her captive, but the place where she would build her future. Together, they turned away from the ruins of their past, the house, the fields, the memories. They were all behind them now. They would leave the ghosts that had haunted them for too long, and in doing so, they would make room for something new, something of their own. Clara's hand found Jack's, their fingers intertwining without a word. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need promises. The future was theirs to shape, together. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt the weight of her choices settle on her shoulders. Not as a burden, but as a strength. She was free. They were free. The dawn was breaking, and with it came a new beginning.